The cold came through the floor first, not through the walls, not through the single south-facing window with its pane of salvaged glass, not through the door frame where the chinking had pulled loose in 2 places and let in a thread of outside air thin enough to see by the candle flames lean. The floor. The bare plank floor that Willa Dodd had laid herself in the 2nd month on the claim, driving cut nails through inch-thick lodgepole slabs with a borrowed hammer and a borrowed nail set, and the specific focus of a woman who has decided that a dirt floor is a thing she will not tolerate, regardless of what the territory thinks about her preferences. She had been proud of that floor. She was less proud of it on the morning of December 3rd, when she woke to find the water bucket frozen solid 8 inches from the stove, and the air in the cabin sitting at a temperature that fogged her breath before she had swung her legs off the rope bed. The stove had not gone out. She could see the glow at the grate. The stove was running, and the floor was conducting cold upward through the lodgepole planks with the patient efficiency of material that has no stake in the outcome, and the cold was winning. Willa sat on the edge of the rope bed with her feet off the floor and looked at the planks and thought about the space beneath them. She was the only woman homesteading alone on the Laramie plains that anyone in the nearby settlement of Carbon could name with certainty. This was not a distinction she had sought. Her husband Roy had died of a stomach complaint in August of 1884, not dramatically, not in any way that made for a story worth telling, just a man who ate something that disagreed with him permanently and was gone in 4 days while the summer was still warm and the claim still needed working. Willa had buried him on the east quarter under a cottonwood that marked the property corner and had gone back to the cabin and continued the work because the work did not stop, and there was nobody else to do it. She was 41 years old. She had been a carpenter's daughter in Ohio before she was a homesteader's wife in Wyoming, and she had grown up watching her father read wood and soil and structure the way other men read scripture, with total absorption and practical application. She had absorbed this without being taught it, the way children absorb things they watch done well repeatedly, and it had surfaced in her repeatedly on the Laramie plains in the 14 months since Roy died. In the specific form of solutions to structural problems that other homesteaders in the Carbon settlement did not seem to arrive at. The floor problem was not new. She had known about it since the first winter on the claim, when Roy was still alive, and the 2 of them had simply endured the cold floor as one of the territory's standard impositions. What was new was her understanding of why it happened and what could be done about it. The Laramie Plains sat at 7,000 feet of elevation on a high basin floor, swept by winds that came off the Medicine Bow Range to the west, with nothing between the mountain face and the basin to reduce their speed or their cold. The ground froze to a depth of 4 feet by January and stayed frozen until April, and a cabin floor built directly over frozen ground conducted that cold upward through whatever material separated them, with a thoroughness that defeated most insulation strategies available on the frontier in 1885. Straw under the planks helped marginally. Packed dirt between the floor joists helped slightly more. Neither addressed the fundamental problem, which was that the ground itself was the cold source, and the floor was in direct contact with it. What Willa had decided to do about it was build a room underground. Not a root cellar. She had a root cellar already, dug into the north bank of the creek 50 yards from the cabin, lined with flat stone, covered with a timber and sod roof that kept it at a stable 38 degrees year-round. What she was building under the cabin was different, a closed airspace, deliberately sized and deliberately sealed, that would sit between the frozen ground and the cabin floor and interrupt the conduction path that was making her floor a refrigeration surface. She had started digging in September, working in the space beneath the cabin floor, through a hatch she cut in the planking beside the south wall, excavating with a short-handled spade in the confined area between the floor joists and the ground surface. The work was slow and cramped. She could not stand upright in the space, could barely kneel, spent most of the digging time on her side or her stomach, turning her head sideways to clear the joists above her. She excavated 18 inches of depth across an area 8 feet by 10 feet, hauling the dirt out in a canvas bucket pulled through the hatch with a rope, dumping it behind the barn, where it would not draw attention or questions from the carbon settlement men who rode by periodically to assess, in their collective estimation, how long she was going to last out here alone. She did not tell any of them what she was building. By the end of October, the excavation was complete. She had lined the walls and floor of the space with flat sandstone slabs hauled from the creek bank, dry-laid in tight courses that sealed the soil behind them and gave the space a floor and walls that would not collapse or soften in spring thaw. She had packed the gaps between slabs with a clay and dry grass mixture that hardened as it dried and was effectively airtight when she pressed her palm flat against it and felt for draft. Then she had sealed the hatch and said nothing about it to anyone. The settlement men had been watching her all winter with the patient attention of people waiting for a specific outcome. 3 of them had already approached her separately about buying the claim at prices she considered insulting. A 4th had offered to take the claim off her hands in exchange for a position in his household that he described with enough euphemism that its nature was unmistakable. She had declined all 4 with the same flat courtesy and returned to her work. Now it was December 3rd. The water bucket was frozen. The floor was cold as iron. And Willa Dodd lifted the hatch beside the south wall and dropped into the space she had built and pulled the hatch shut above her and sat in the complete dark for a moment, her palms flat on the sandstone floor. It was warmer than the cabin above. Not warm. Warmer. The sealed airspace had been sitting between the frozen ground and the cabin floor for 6 weeks, insulated from both by the sandstone lining and the airtight clay chinking, and it had settled at a temperature that the ground below it could not pull down and the outside air above it could not reach. She pressed both palms flat against the stone floor and held them there and felt the difference and understood, sitting in the dark under her own floor, that the idea had worked exactly as she calculated it would. She had more work to do. The temperature differential was 11 degrees. Willa measured it the way she measured everything she built, not with instruments she did not have, but with the calibrated observation of a woman who had learned from her father that measurement was not a function of tools, but of attention. She had spent enough time in the cabin above to know its temperature by the behavior of her breath, the feel of the air on her face, the rate at which the water bucket iced over after the stove was banked for the night. She spent equivalent time in the space below and cross-referenced what she felt against what she did. And the differential she arrived at was 11 degrees. Not precise. Close enough to be useful. 11 degrees was the difference between a cabin floor that conducted cold upward through the planks and a cabin floor that sat above a sealed air buffer that the frozen ground could not reach. 11 degrees was the difference between waking to a frozen water bucket and waking to water that was cold but liquid. In a Wyoming Territory's December at elevation, 11 degrees was significant in ways that compounded across a winter rather than staying flat. She spent 3 days in December enlarging the space, not in footprint. The excavation already covered the cabin's full usable floor area, and she had no reason to go beyond the foundation perimeter. She enlarged it in utility. She brought down through the hatch a short pine bench she had built from scrap lumber, low enough to clear the joists above it, and set it against the east sandstone wall. She brought down a second wool blanket and folded it across the bench surface. She brought down the small tin lantern she used for barn work, filled with rendered tallow, and hung it from a spike she drove into the underside of the floor joist above the bench. The lantern changed the calculation considerably. A single tallow lantern burning in a sealed space 8 feet on 10 feet on 18 inches of headroom produced a measurable heat output, not enough to warm a room by any standard, but enough to raise the temperature in a space that's small by 4 to 6 degrees above its ambient when the lantern had been burning for an hour. Willa had understood this theoretically from watching her father use lantern heat in his workshop to keep glue pots workable in Ohio winters. She confirmed it practically by sitting on the bench with the lantern lit and the hatch sealed above her, and noting when she could remove her coat and still be comfortable. The answer was 31 minutes. She wrote this in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, alongside the dimensions of the excavation and the thickness of the sandstone courses and the composition of the clay chinking mix. The notebook had 14 pages of entries by December, all in her father's influence. Measurements, observations, modifications, results. No emotions, no narrative. Just data recorded by a woman who had decided that understanding what she had built was more important than feeling anything about it. The space became her primary living area in the worst cold. Not exclusively. She maintained the cabin above for cooking, which required the cast iron stove and the vertical flue that the underground space could not accommodate without a vent solution she had not yet engineered. She went up to cook twice daily, managed the stove with the efficiency of someone who had learned to minimize the time she spent in a cold room, and came back down through the hatch carrying her food and her coffee in a covered tin pail that retained heat long enough to eat from without reheating. The neighbors noticed something was wrong with their observations. The carbon settlement men who rode by periodically to check on the claim's trajectory toward abandonment had been monitoring the cabin's smoke output as a proxy for Willa's survival status. A cabin producing regular smoke meant a working stove meant a person still functioning inside. What they observed through December was a cabin producing less smoke than it should have if the occupant was burning enough wood to stay warm. 2 of them rode up to the door in the second week of December and knocked, certain they were about to find a woman who had run out of wood, or resolve, or both. Willa answered the door in her coat, with color in her face, and offered them coffee. They came in and stood by the stove and looked at the wood supply stacked against the south wall, reduced by 1/3 from what they had seen in November, and looked at each other with the particular expression of men whose prediction has not delivered the expected result. The cabin was cold by any comfortable standard. The floor was cold under their boots, but the woman standing in it was not diminished, not desperate, not presenting any of the visible signs of a person at the end of their capacity. One of them asked how she was managing the heat. Willa told him she had made some modifications to the cabin's insulation. She said this in the tone she used for information she was providing rather than explaining, and she did not elaborate, and the man did not ask further because the tone did not invite it. They drank their coffee and left, and Willa watched them ride south from the doorway, and then went to the hatch and dropped back into the space below. The real test arrived on the night of December 19th. The temperature on the Laramie Plains dropped to -26 degrees between midnight and 4 in the morning, driven by a wind off the Medicine Bow Range that hit the cabin's west wall with a sustained lateral force that Willa felt through the floor joists as a faint vibration, the entire structure resonating at a frequency just below audible. The stove was banked. The cabin above was cold enough by 2 in the morning that the nail heads in the roof boards had each grown a small white crystal of condensation frost, a phenomenon Willa had read about in a government survey report on high-altitude construction, and was now observing firsthand from the hatch opening when she lifted it briefly to check the cabin temperature. She let the hatch fall back and sat on the bench in the underground space with the lantern burning and her second wool blanket across her shoulders, and her hands wrapped around the covered tin pail that still held warmth from the evening coffee. And she listened to the wind work at the structure above her and felt the temperature in the space around her and did the arithmetic she had been doing since September. The space was holding at 22 degrees above the outside ambient. The cabin above her was holding at 6 degrees above outside ambient. The difference between those two numbers was 16 degrees, and 16 degrees at minus 26 outside was the difference between survival and the specific category of cold that the carbon settlement men were waiting for her to succumb to. Outside, 3 of the settlement's homesteaders were burning fence rails. A 4th had moved his family into his barn to share heat with the livestock. The Bauer family, 2 miles east, had abandoned their cabin entirely and ridden south to Carbon to wait out the worst of it in the settlement's single boarding house, leaving everything they owned in a structure that would be frozen solid by morning. Willa sat in her underground space with her lantern and her blanket and her covered tin pail and did not go anywhere. The Bauer family came back from Carbon on the 4th day. Willa watched them come up the trail from the south. Heinrich Bauer on the wagon seat, his wife Marta beside him, their 3 children packed in the wagon bed under every blanket they owned. They had spent 4 days in the Carbon boarding house at 50 cents a night, which was money Heinrich did not have in comfortable surplus, and they had come home to a cabin where the water barrel had burst from freezing and the flour sack had been gotten into by something that had come through a gap in the doorframe that the cold had opened up while they were gone. Heinrich came to Willa's door that afternoon because she was the nearest neighbor and because the burst barrel meant no water and because pride has a temperature below which it stops functioning as a reliable guide to behavior. He asked if she could spare any water until he got the barrel repaired. She gave him water and a portion of dried beans, and did not mention the barrel repair, which she could see from his face he already understood was going to require materials he would need to source from Carbon. Marta Bauer came with him and stood in Willa's cabin and looked around with the careful eyes of a woman assessing another woman's situation honestly. The cabin was cold. The wood supply was visibly reduced. But Willa was composed and warm-faced and moving without the stiffness that extreme cold worked into a person's joints after days of sustained exposure. And Marta was a perceptive woman who recognized that something in this cabin situation did not match its apparent conditions. She asked Willa directly how she was staying warm. Willa looked at her for a moment. She had kept the underground space private for 3 months on the calculation that privacy was a form of protection, that a solution nobody knew about was a solution nobody could interfere with, claim credit for, or attempt to acquire. That calculation had served her through the worst of December and into January. But Marta Bauer was standing in her cabin with burst barrel water on her boots and 3 children in a wagon outside, and the arithmetic of the situation had changed. Willa pulled the hatch open and showed her. Marta crouched at the hatch opening and looked down into the space, the sandstone-lined walls, the pine bench, the tallow lantern on its spike, the wool blanket folded across the bench surface, the clay-chinked joints between the stone courses. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked how long it had taken to build. Willa said 6 weeks of evenings working through the hatch with a short-handled spade. Marta asked what the temperature differential was. Willa told her 11 degrees at ambient and up to 22 degrees with the lantern burning. Marta sat back on her heels and looked at the hatch opening without speaking. Then she asked if Heinrich could build one. Willa said she would show him how. Heinrich came 3 days later with a spade and the questions of a man who builds things and wants to understand what he is building before he starts. Willa walked him through the excavation dimensions, the sandstone lining, the clay chinking mix, 2 parts creek clay to 1 part dry grass fiber, mixed to the consistency of stiff bread dough, packed into the joints with a wooden paddle and smoothed with a wet hand. She showed him the hatch construction, the bench height, the lantern placement. She showed him the notebook entries, the temperature measurements, the modification sequence, the performance data from December's worst nights. Heinrich read the notebook with his hat in his hands and did not say anything immediately. Then he said he had been homesteading for 9 years in Kansas and Wyoming, and he had never seen a woman keep records like this. Willa said her father had been a carpenter, and that a carpenter who did not keep records was a carpenter who repeated his mistakes. Heinrich said that was true of most things. He went home and started digging the following morning. Word moved through the carbon settlement the way word moved in small communities, not announced, but transmitted, person to person, with the specific velocity of information that has immediate practical value. By the end of January, 4 families had dug subfloor spaces using Willa's dimensions and her chinking mix formula. 2 of them sent their oldest children to her door with questions she answered at the threshold without inviting anyone in, because the habit of privacy does not dissolve entirely just because the emergency that required it has passed. February came in hard. The Medicine Bow Range delivered 3 consecutive storms across the Laramie Plains in the first 2 weeks, each one resetting the snow depth before the previous accumulation had settled, building a consolidated pack that reached the bottom rail of Willa's fence line by the 10th and covered it entirely by the 15th. The temperature between storms did not recover above 0. It sat between -8 and -15 for 11 consecutive days. And the carbon settlement contracted around its stoves and its underground spaces, and it stored fuel and waited. Willa's wood supply ran lower than she had projected. Not critically, she had built in a margin against exactly this scenario, but lower than the notebook had predicted based on December's burn rates. The February cold was sustained in a way December's cold had not been, the overnight lows staying low rather than recovering by midday, and the stove was running 3 hours longer each day than the December data suggested it would need to. She noted the variance in the notebook and adjusted the burn rate downward, cooking once daily instead of twice, and eating the second meal cold, and the adjusted rate brought the projected supply back inside her margin. She ran out of tallow for the lantern on February 20th. This was the one failure of the winter, and she recorded it as such in the notebook without elaboration. The underground space without the lantern ran 4 to 6 degrees colder than it ran with it, which put the nighttime temperature at 17 degrees above outside ambient rather than 22. Still survivable. Colder than she wanted. She replaced the tallow with rendered beef fat she had been storing for soap making, which burned dirtier and produced more smoke, but generated equivalent heat output. And the underground space returned to its functional temperature within 40 minutes of the first lighting. The last storm of the season broke on the 4th of March. Willa climbed out of the hatch on the morning of the 5th and went outside and stood in the snow and looked at the Laramie plains in the specific clear light that follows a hard winter's last storm. The sky a deep, unambiguous blue, the snow surface crusted and glittering. The Medicine Bow Range to the west, standing sharp-edged against the sky without the haze that storm systems carried in front of them. She had been on this claim for 2 years and 3 months. The notebook in her coat pocket had 41 pages of entries. The underground space had performed within 2 degrees of her September projections on every night of the winter except the tallow failure, which was a procurement error and not a design error, and she had already noted the correction. Heinrich Bauer rode up from the south an hour later and stopped at the fence line and told her all of 4 families who had built subfloor spaces had come through the winter without abandoning their claims. He said the Kimball family on the North Flat, who had not built one, had lost 2 fingers to frostbite between them and had burned every piece of furniture they owned except the beds. Willa said she was sorry to hear about the Kimballs. She said she would ride over that afternoon and see what they needed. Heinrich looked at the cabin and then at Willa and said the settlement had been taking bets since October on how long she would last out here alone. Willa said she was aware of that. He asked if she wanted to know what the over-under had been. She said she did not need to know. She said she had not built the space to win a bet. She said she had built it because the floor was cold, and she understood why, and she knew what to do about it. She went inside and put the coffee on, and opened the notebook to a fresh page.